There's a lesson in simplicity somewhere in here. Somewhere between actual manufactured PCB to control a steering wheel, which is perfectly fine, a watch-style speedometer and tachometer mounted slightly below the display, that might be pushing it. That being said, practicality went away the moment I shoved a V12 into a 550 kilogram race car. But trust me, it isn't as complicated as it looks. It's way more complicated than it looks. I feel like the immediate scary thing is a PCB, a printed circuit board. It was for me because I had never designed one and I dreaded it for the entire project. It took me basically 2 days from when I sat down and started learning it to when I uploaded my pack to PCBWay to get it coming this way. It's a lot less daunting than it seems when it's simple components like this. I used Easy EDA, which I'm not sponsored by any of these people, but this is my process on this. On the schematic side, connect everything and don't worry about making it pretty. Just put everything where it needs to go and go in with the understanding that all the little dots need to be connected. When you get to the board side, for better or worse, I already had the DXF file that I knew fit the steering wheel. So I was able to import that, set it as my board outline, and then go through, make sure all my components worked, and then I manually placed all of the traces on this board. I couldn't really get auto trace to work, but there's not really that many components on this, so it didn't really matter, and I'm not using any surface mount. I'm using all through hole things. A few things to note. Arduino Nanos don't contain enough input-outputs to handle all of the switches, and I'm using rotary encoders, so that was actually really easy. But for the switches, I just built a voltage divider, so my left side buttons and my right side buttons only use one analog in on the microcontroller. That's what all these resistors are doing here. The screen uses TXRX, and my wireless protocol is an, oh, I can do this off the top of my head, L3005NC. No idea what that actually is, but we weren't even close. And just some standard servo headers that I ran some heavy traces through just to handle the amperage. And when I say amperage, I mean under an amp, but we ran 35 mil traces over there anyways. One of the things I would change is how these pads interact with the switches themselves. The idea was, given a standard momentary with solder connections, which is what I had laying around, I decided to just build through holes and then 2 pads to solder onto. And you can see it looks absolutely atrocious. There's no saving that. So realistically, what I would do in the future is change switches or just avoid this situation entirely. The actual steering wheel base started out as the one from a couple of years ago. I started with the exact same CAD file and extruded it outwards. And then took away some material that wasn't needed, added some cool contouring, and then built the entire circuit board mounting bracket and everything into the actual piece of billet itself. This makes the assembly of the actual circuit board a snap. If I'm honest, having a mill is the cheat code to life. You can just build whatever you want to your heart's content. I mean, fundamentally, I can design something on the computer, send it to that machine, and it takes a block of material and, well, turns it into this in 35 minutes, which is really, really nice. Not counting me flipping it over. Also, yeah, I'm not thrilled with these grips either. These are the ones off the original wheel. They're printed out of TPU. I'm still working on what to actually go through and do on these. I might just try and print something simple and get them wrapped in leather or Alcantara or some such material. And the board just gets held on with 2 M4 screws. Actually, all of the screws on this are M4s, except for the ones that aren't. And then the back panel just goes right over the top of it and snaps down. There's also the back panel to the back panel that actually has the 7-pin connector that actually has the few wires that connect everything here, just delivering 5-volt power to the board and handling the 12-volt side with ignition and start. This doesn't fit right now because the Arduino's too tall. That's because I put it on headers instead of just hard soldering it to the board, which throughout all the testing in this, I am not upset about that at all. So we'll just leave that off. for the moment. And then 4 M4 screws. All of this is printed out of ASA, which means that it's weather resistant and plenty strong enough for decorative covers. And then the servos go on an M4 right in the middle. You can see my 2 servo headers over there. And now for the piece of resistance that was this mechanical tachometer. It honestly wasn't that bad. There was a lot of fiddling with fit and finish that just took forever, which I think I have an entirely new respect for clockmakers at this point because, yeah, everything has to talk to each other real nice, otherwise things just kind of fall apart, which is interesting. Starting with this front plate, this is out of brass, and I think the design works really well. I think the details work less well. I think my numbers are too small, but I don't think that's really avoidable at the current design. We're still figuring out engraving. I, for a long time, have just been taking way too heavy of a cut on the engraver that I've learned. The speedometer wheel is in the same fashion, except it's out of aluminum, and we'll get to the 2 larger gears in a moment, but the smaller gears, one of which is pressed and then peened onto the backside of this, are brass gears from McMaster Carr, which fit perfectly, so it's a press fit into this. And then for our pivot shaft, which is an 1/8 inch dowel pin, it is a press fit onto here. The idea is this is a fixed gear to the shaft, this one slides over to the top and spins and is driven by the top gear, and then Then this gear is driven on the bottom, and the small needle slides onto the top of that. So the bottom gear drives this drives this. Whee! The other 2 gears are printed out of nylon. I thought I was being slick, pun intended, but brass would have held better tolerances, and luckily I designed them around the larger gears, brass gears that you can order from McMaster, and then I can just do some milling, and I'll probably end up doing that just to bring these into tolerance a little bit more, although I actually do love the black contrast against the aluminum. I think it works quite well aesthetically. I was originally going to make this dowel pin on the lathe, but there really wasn't any need, so I just grabbed one out of the bin. I installed these little brass guide bushings so that each one of these just drops in there, should be locked in, and then we run the set screw. Ideally, this just drops in here, like that. This is press fit, but it probably could be changed in the future. While we're here, I'm going to just press on our dials, which don't have anything underneath them. I do plan to, in the small little windows, put something that we can actually, use. But for right now, this works. Servos on the backside get plugged into the headers, and cables hidden professionally for a moment while I handle whatever's going on here. So let's fire this up for the first time. This is that initialize function that I was talking about. When I cut power to this, it has no idea where any of these encoders actually end up. So when I spin these, it doesn't really matter. Because I want these positional to something ideally underneath one of these windows at some point in time, I have these initialized. So we move our dials to the start position, and we press initialize, and that starts our cycle. So I've created a couple of menus here. Obviously, this is a dashboard menu, and then we have a TPMS menu, and then just so on and so forth. Some excellent graphic design on these final ones down here. But there's a lot of expandability on things that we can do here. So to test to make sure our wireless protocol is working, I have a second Arduino set up and hooked up to the same wireless protocol, and the worst potentiometer in the world to control our speedometer and tachometer. As you can see, our tach needle moves very, very nicely, and our speedometer moves less nicely. Realistically, I could get it to move nicely if I go really, really slow. The problem is the pulling on this potentiometer is just not great. It's just set really, really low. So when I go to try and move it a little bit, it moves a lot. But both of them can run independently, of course. And just for the fun of it, a nice sweep program. Before we talk about code, that's a pretty cool poster I have in the background, and if you want one or you want other merch that I made, check it out in the link in the description below. So I designed some hubs for this car as well. I was using the Porsche uprights or the Porsche hubs with the Porsche brakes. Now I'm just going to use the Porsche brakes and completely redesign that rear hub. I just wasn't getting the suspension geometry that I needed, and I was fighting that McPherson strut something fierce. I was going to have them machined out for this video, but I bought this 28 by 8 by 3 block of aluminum, which would have worked, except I need a 3.5-inch block of aluminum. So yeah, great. Also, wheels. So a lot of people recommended in the last video 3-piece wheels, and that's a great idea, and I like that a lot. I've never dealt with them. So that's a little bit of a learning process that I'm going through at the moment, but I think I'm gonna go with a set of 17-inch single-step wheels, which gets me down to a 15.45-inch outside diameter center, which I could machine on the mill. So I drew these up in CAD, and I might tweak them still a little bit, but I think that's the direction that I'm leaning towards. I can pretend like I know what I'm doing when it comes to programming. I don't. I overspec the hardware and then write bad code. What that means is that at no part during this section should you take what I'm doing as a good idea. And also I'm going to do the exact same thing that Nolan did in Oppenheimer for really, really long monologues and just kind of cut away to psychedelic images occasionally. Because, you know, if it's good enough for Nolan. Realistically, there's not a whole lot going on that's particularly weird. Going back to the original wheel, the display was nothing more than a display. The Arduino was doing all of the heavy lifting. The Nextion display that I'm using right now has a built-in microcontroller that's being used as a microcontroller to run the display. That way, all the Arduino has to do is take data from A, send it over to the display, and let the display handle the rest of it. The display is using a serial protocol that literally allows me to write strings to it, which is what I do kind of probably too much. Say I wanted to go from page 2 to page 4, which is the dashboard to the TPMS menu. All I would do in the console is write page 4. So therefore, all I have to do in the Arduino is send a serial print line to the display that says page 2, and then it just handles it from there. The animations are a little bit more difficult. It's a display that doesn't really have a bunch of sliders and other things that I'm able to use or able to put a graphical interface on. It has the very basic minimum. So I had to sit down and learn how to become a graphic designer, which I was not thrilled about. So I opened up Photoshop, I chose some fonts that I liked, and started drawing some boxes and some squares, and came up with something that looked somewhat reasonable. Using the timeline feature in Photoshop, I'm able to animate something with keyframes fairly easily, export as an image series, and upload all of those images to the display. Say I wanted to change from keyframe 23 on the tachometer to keyframe 24 on the tachometer, I just send a photo command that alternates to that photo in that specific series. So realistically, Arduino communicating with the display is easy as serial print line whatever you want, and then understanding that the Nextion display uses the weirdest, worst version of C that I don't like it at all. It's like a Wild West Bauhaus version of minimalist C that is just kind of awful. I don't want to badmouth Bauhaus. The NRF library, the wireless protocol, there's not much I'm changing on it from any number of examples that you can pull from the internet. The only problem is getting it fast enough to where it'll actually tolerate what I'm trying to do. Outside of one panel on the back, that kind of wraps up the steering wheel project, which is kind of nice. We're also made some progress on getting this on all 4 wheels, so realistically it's progress, just awfully slowly. I'd really like to know how you guys feel about the wheels and how the rest of this project's going. If you would, leave a comment down below, like, subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw, and yeah, thank you very much for watching. Waiting for the truck to drive. Okay, cool.